Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Our guest today is David Jaber. David is the founder of Climate Positive Consulting, a firm that measures carbon footprint, crafts business climate strategy, and drives greenhouse gas reduction. David has worked with over 100 companies on greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy. He is also the author of Climate Positive Business, How You and Your Company Hit Bold Climate Goals and Go Net Zero. He otherwise spends his time restoring watersheds, holding politicians accountable, and turning off lights. David, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. I think the premise of this podcast is fantastic, actually. The two of you promising to unveil all the salacious details behind B Lab and B corporations. How can you not listen?
We like to keep folks on the edge of our seats, for sure, of their seats. Could you tell us a little bit about your background? Before you first got involved with the B Corp movement, what were some of the things that you were up to?
Of course. So I've been working in sustainability consulting for the last 23 years, I guess now. I started with a small consulting firm out of the Bay Area called Natural Logic, where we got to do things like work on HP's first sustainability reports back in the day, and also a lot of waste reduction consulting. So I was in that role for 7 years, and then I struck out on my own and ended up founding the predecessor company to Climate Positive Consulting. So Climate Positive and its predecessor have been around for about 14 years, with an increasing emphasis on working with companies on greenhouse gas reduction strategy. So as you said, that's measuring carbon footprint, it's setting targets and putting a plan together to hit the reduction target successfully. And so we've worked with kind of a range of manufacturing companies, probably on somewhat on the larger end of B Corp size, but it's a range of industry sectors and a range of sizes that we end up working with. And I guess my intro to the B Corporation community is probably almost a decade ago now through some of the local B Lab gatherings, I guess B Lab builds, I think it was just sort of the term. And then for a couple of years, I was working with another company that I helped bring into B Corporation circles. That was around 2016. So I've been around the B Corporation community for about the last 8.
Amazing.
That's great to hear that you found out through B Corp Build. Were you also involved with Project Drawdown, like pretty early on?
I was sort of in the first cohort, and that would have been in 2015. I'm pretty sure you and I actually met at a build probably a couple of years before that, though.
Awesome. Why don't we jump in to the topic for today? So we invited David on because David's an expert in GHG emissions accounting and understanding net zero and science-based targets. And as listeners may or may not know, there's a new question on the B Corp, the new evolution of standards topic called climate action. And to frame up why B Lab included that topic, they say, recent years have been the warmest on record. According to the latest scientific data, the world is on the path to exceed global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, as well as 2 degrees Celsius during the 21st century, unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. B Lab goes on to say, in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, global emissions must be cut to 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, and the world would need to achieve net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And then finally, B Lab says, although progress has been made towards these reductions, the scope and scale is not yet enough. The window of opportunity to limit global warming is closing. The world has already seen widespread adverse impacts to nature and communities from climate change, extreme weather events, and sea level rise, with vulnerable communities being disproportionately affected. Effort must be stepped up as the planet cannot afford any more delays or greenwashing. So that's, I guess, part of the reason why B Lab included it. And what we hope to do with David today is to dive into the three subtopics of this climate action larger topic. And David, before we jump into those, does this, what I just read, generally match your understanding of the problem statement and the importance of this topic? And did you have anything else to add?
Generally, yes. So we need action to reduce emissions to avoid all the negative impacts that you just listed off. There have been some positive signs, but clearly nowhere near enough. You may have seen news that there's an expectation that global emissions will peak this year, which is good news until you look at what IPCC just said, which effectively we need to drop emissions about 10% per year. It's a good news, but it's also not enough. I think the one part of that some might take issue with is if you look at warming records over the last year, we're about at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming now. However, I don't actually think that affects this goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. We should still get on this reduction trajectory that IPCC is calling out and work to cut emissions in line with this, even if we are at 1.5 or 1.6 or whatever the actual number is. It's more about the action rather than kind of the current state of where we are.
And just so folks know, what is the IPCC, just so we can just want to make sure we define that.
Right. One of many climate acronyms that gets thrown around. That is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of thousands of scientists that have been studying climate for about 30 plus years now. And the ultimate source for a lot of our understanding and knowledge about climate science and how it affects the planet.
Thanks. So in this section, the first requirement, regardless of the size of the company, is that, quote, the company measures greenhouse gas emissions in its operations and value chain annually, following the methodology of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Could you explain what that means for a company that is attempting to go at this for the first time?
I can. If I might just step back and maybe kind of go a level up first.
Yeah.
And part of the caveat on this, so I think as the two of you know, these standards aren't yet final. We might expect some changes in the details, but I think the fundamentals, I don't see how those would change as the requirement for B corporations. And that's this basic three-part process. Measure emissions, set a target to reduce those emissions, and then create a plan to hit the target. Mm-hmm. So I think those three elements will still be there. And as you just said, the measurement is sort of the first part of that. Well, I guess there's probably a couple terms in there that are going to be challenging. One is maybe operations and value chain, but probably more importantly, greenhouse gas protocol. Does that feel accurate of sort of the things that aren't clear in that sentence? Okay, great. So the greenhouse gas protocol is the standard created to help businesses measure their carbon footprint. If anyone listening to this has ever heard the term scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, that comes from the greenhouse gas protocol. And within that, in scope 3 in particular, there's actually several subcategories. So the protocol lists out, what these different categories are and how you need to go about sort of measuring your emissions kind of in these three different areas. Most reporting that you'll see out there, I think virtually all the reporting I've seen always tracks the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is not a B corporation specific thing. It is kind of like the standard that's virtually always referenced in terms of greenhouse gas measurements. And then operations and value chain. Operations, there's a couple of different ways that you can gauge what your operations are, but usually that's sort of the assets, the facilities and fleets that you have control over. So you might think of it as just solely the building. So if you have a headquarter buildings, that might be all of your kind of scope 1 and scope 2 related emissions, or operations, I guess is the term we were trying to define here. And then value chain would be everything both in your upstream supply chain as well as downstream. So if you create a product, you're sourcing ingredients and raw materials that need to be processed and packaged and delivered to your facilities. And then if you're creating a product, that's also packaged and kind of sent to your customers eventually. So all the value chains, everything sort of outside your operations in those two different upstream and downstream portions of your product flow, essentially. So I don't know if that helped alleviate jargon or actually introduced more, but that's where we're at.
That was awesome. And so to clarify, would a company that, because I feel like there are a lot of B Corps who are like, I'm just a, remote office, work from home, or, it's like 12 of us in a marketing like B2B company. And so how is this some of these questions that are coming up going to be relevant to me. Do you have thoughts on why it might be important for, say, a small services company versus like a large manufacturer to also understand their footprint and their emissions?
Sure. I think that frequently comes up with service companies because they're not creating products that need to be physically removed around, but they still are purchasing things, whether that's IT services, marketing support, office paper, telecommunications, that are also deemed to have a greenhouse gas footprint. And there's ways to kind of gauge what that is. They'll probably have less sort of on the downstream portion of their delivery of their product. But one category of scope 3 that ends up being pretty huge is business travel. So a lot of service companies, like if you're in consulting or whatever it is, you'll be traveling to like client sites, the conferences. That's sort of part of what needs to be your footprint too. Commuting is also another aspect that is supposed to be measured. And to your point of why you need to measure it at all, I think it's part of the common understanding of our responsibility around climate. A lot of service companies, I think you gave sort of a marketing example. Sure, you're not as carbon intensive like a steel producer, but there's still an understanding that we're trying to broadly distribute kind of the responsibility for climate. Everyone has a role to play. Parts of your job are easier because there's other things you don't have to decarbonize. The idea is that we're all kind of taking responsibility for climate emissions. And I think there are some exemptions or way that B Lab is making it easier if you're like under a certain threshold, or you actually have a service that is designed to help decarbonization, like a renewable energy supplier, if that's part of your business model.
And decarbonization just means reducing your carbon footprint.
Yeah, exactly. Reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, reducing your carbon footprint. You might hear me say greenhouse gas inventory, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint. Those are all sort of interchangeable terms that really reflects the amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced as a result of your business being in business.
I'm just going to give a shout out to David's online course at TerraDo because what is the name of the course? It's carbon accounting. Is that the
Carbon
name?
accounting and reduction.
Carbon accounting and reduction. So if you are like me out there, fair listener, and you are like, what the heck do I need to know for some of this GHG emission stuff? It's not enough where you're going to be overwhelmed and curled up in a ball on the floor. It's like a good amount of information. It's enough to be dangerous, maybe. It's not like you're going to have a PhD. And I would really recommend David's course because it sort of explains some of this stuff in more detail than we're going to be able to get to in this podcast. So shout out for David's course. Anything else you want to say about the course? Mid-podcast plug for the course?
Well, first of all, glad to hear you weren't curled up in a ball on the floor, kind of working through that. If you go to terra.do online, you'll be able to see sort of when the next course launches. This round, we actually did have a discount for B corporations. I think it was on the order of 20%. We'll see if we can extend that to all the listeners.
Okay. Well, so let's return to curling up in ball here. Just kidding. So for folks, just to sort of like reset with folks who are listening, we're in the climate action, larger topic, and we're in one of the 3 subtopics. So the 3 subtopics are measuring GHG emissions. The second is science-based targets. And the third is climate transition plan. So every B Corp, regardless of size, will have to answer questions in each of these. And so David just explained the basics of what GHG emissions are and the operations and value chain, and also the greenhouse gas protocol. And so once the sort of requirement of all B Corps to measure their GHG emissions, so the second point we're going to get to within this first section is what is the evidence that B Lab actually requires, which is one thing I really like about the evolution of standards is they're very clear about what evidence you would need to produce in order to meet the goal. Often in the current version, you don't really know what would actually qualify. So B Lab says the evidence of meeting this requirement is a copy of the company's GHG emissions report from the last fiscal year or all years since the previous certification. And it says the report must include gross scope 1, 2, and 3 data and carbon intensity calculations, as well as detail the accounting tools and methodology used and an explanation for any missing scope 3 categories. So there's a lot of jargon in there, Dave. Maybe we can take it one chunk at a time. So the first chunk is just like, what is a company's GHG emissions report? What does that usually look like?
That could be pretty simple. It would just be the annual snapshots of your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions that they just talked about. And we can define that in a moment, but basically scope 1 and scope 2 pertains to your operations. Scope 3 is your value chain, as we talked about those earlier. The other thing that's interesting about the way they worded that, so it's clear for recertification that you have to calculate your emissions each year because they ask for every year since the last certification.
Yeah, that's a sneaky aspect for sure.
Yeah. And then could you define gross scope 1, 2, and 3 data?
Yeah. By gross, I understand they mean absolute. So it's just the amount of each of those emissions. So scope 1 refers to emissions that are directly coming from out of your operations. So if you have the facilities and possibly fleet of vehicles that we talked about earlier, and I realize not all B Corps are going to have vehicles, but let's just suspend our sense of reality for the moment. Those would be emissions literally coming out of smokestacks and tailpipes. It would generally be combustion of natural gas on sites. It could be gasoline or diesel in vehicles. Actually, refrigerants that escape from refrigerators or air conditioning systems are also part of scope 1. So you can think of that as gases coming off directly from your site. Scope 2 is a form of indirect emissions. And for most organizations, their only scope 2 is electricity. And the idea is that for these utilities you have hardwired into your operations, you're making decisions that affect electricity use, but the emissions actually happen at the other end of the wires at the power plant. And then so scope 3 then is everything else in your value chain. So I talked about the goods and services that you purchase. It's the transportation to get those materials to your facilities and to your operations, as well as the transportation to deliver products away from that operations. And we said earlier, service companies don't necessarily have all these aspects, but business travel, commute, and a few other different categories sort of crop up in scope 3 that are going to be relevant to companies needing to go through this.
Great. I really like, for some reason, I got it when you said smokestacks and tailpipes for scope 1. I was like, I could see the number 1 as like the smokestack or the tailpipe. So that made sense to me. Thank you. Gas, and that's like gasoline and, natural gas, and then I guess refrigerants that escape. Although that's probably more technical than a lot of B Corps maybe need to know at this point. And then scope 2 is electricity, commonly, like that's the most common one. And then scope 3 is basically everything else: the travel, the products, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
Did I reflect back correctly?
Yeah, that also could be the natural gas, gasoline, and electricity that your suppliers are using or your downstream distributors. So some of the same aspects, it can be easier to visualize it maybe that way too.
Okay, so David, the next part is on carbon intensity calculations. So could you define that part for us?
B-Lab defined that for us, I believe. So it's metric tons of carbon dioxide per $1 million of revenue. So in contrast to gross, where you're just looking at how much greenhouse gas emissions did you produce, intensity is normalizing that to the amount of revenue that you create. Not all reporting will ask for this, but there are some places where it's advantageous to calculate intensity. And when we talk about targets, there are actually ways that intensity targets can show up in that. Sometimes it's actually easier to make progress on an intensity target than reducing your gross emissions, but we can table that until later.
Right. And so intensity would be, our company generated 100,000 in revenue and we created 100 tons of carbon. And then the next year we generated 200,000 in revenue, but our metric tons went down to like 50. So we actually created more product, but had like a bigger reduction. So that would make our carbon intensity number much smaller. Is that right?
Exactly, compared with gross.
Yeah. So last part of this long sentence that the B-Lab is asking for evidence is you also can provide the details on the accounting tools and methodology used and an explanation for any missing scope 3 categories. Could you translate that into English for us?
Sure. Methodology should mostly be following the greenhouse gas protocol, but you could detail things that the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't, like maybe your data collection process or maybe ways you estimated certain things, because the greenhouse gas protocol isn't necessarily going to inform that. Accounting tools. So I believe they will accept any accounting, and this could be an Excel sheet. So you could do, well, a lot of this work can be done in spreadsheets. There are also a lot of software platforms, including a few that are provided by B Corps, that can help you with this, where it's more a user-friendly interface and you don't have to worry about kind of building your own spreadsheet. Those are also available at cost. But as long as those tools are greenhouse gas protocol compatible, and again, almost virtually all of them should be, those should suffice for the tools you're using. And then an explanation for missing scope 3 categories. So as we were talking about earlier, scope 3 is kind of these further flung emission sources that aren't directly your operations, where you have a lot more control and knowledge and certainty about what's going on. So you may choose frequently in greenhouse gas reporting to exclude certain categories. Maybe you don't have good information. Maybe you said it's going to be a lot of effort and it looks like it's only 1% of our footprint, so we're not going to be concerned with it. But whatever your rationale is, B-Lab is just asking for an explanation of like why not all scope 3 categories are reported. And there are 15 categories of scope 3. And we don't need to list them all off, I don't think. I already hit on sort of several when I was talking about scope 3 earlier. But those would be the 15 categories that you would address kind of in answering that question.
It's giving math homework, show your work type vibes.
How much time? I mean, it's sort of like how long is a piece of string? It's like, it depends. But maybe what is the level of effort, David, to do some of this? Like, are we talking, so maybe we could even choose like one of the small-ish home office based, like remote B Corp that's a service company versus like a large, maybe a 250 person manufacturer. What is the time and like energy level that people might need to put into this type of work to figure this out?
That's a good question. So B Corp actually asked, and we actually didn't talk about this earlier, but part of what I was thinking of coming into this is we could talk about like actually how we got here and go back to like there's this net zero by 2030 commitments that about a quarter of the B Corp community made in 2019 that spurred, I think, some climate goals. So maybe just sort of truncate that. Those of us who signed up for that were encouraged to either set a science-based target or work with SME Climate Hub. An SME Climate Hub is an aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goal and public commitment for small companies, which most B Corps qualify for. So SME Climate Hub has a free tool that you can use to sort of estimate your footprint. It's very rough, but if you needed to use that, and you're sort of small service company where it doesn't make sense to put in all this effort, that's something you could probably do in a handful of days. You just need to collect like your utility information. So that's on sort of the extreme end, is how you could pretty quickly get at least an estimate of your greenhouse gas footprint. For most of the companies that I work with, and this would be sort of on the larger side of B Corps, or even sort of larger than most of our B corporations, it typically will be sort of a 4-month process because you are making this concerted effort to be as accurate as possible. A lot of these companies are sort of publicly exposed and they want to have a lot of credibility and be able to stand behind any public claims because they're under scrutiny. So that could be sort of a 4-month process. And usually the first time an organization's doing this, they'll probably need 6 to 8 weeks just to make sure they have good data and go to data holders that haven't been asked to provide this information before, explain the request clearly, and probably have some back and forth on quality assurance. I think it really depends. And even with that 4-month time frame, you'll still have some questions on scope 3. There's sort of inherently some uncertainty there. But for companies that are larger and really looking to make a concerted effort on getting good numbers together, it certainly can take time.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many different like levels of how you can be collecting and organizing and measuring this data. It's like you can do it manually, which I've heard you advocate for before many times, which is super helpful, the DIY version. But there's also like different kinds of softwares that will help you. Like you can upload your data and your information into the platform. And then there's even more of an involvement level where a lot of these softwares will like just pull the data for you once you connect the things. And it's just like constantly measuring things. So I think it really does vary from company to company and like the scope of what you're measuring, and it's a pretty wide range of how much time it could take for anyone. And then for large companies, in this impact topic of measuring GHG emissions, the third thing here, it says for large companies and above, and B-Lab is currently defining this as 250 employees or more than $75 million in revenue. There is an additional requirement that an independent third party verifies that the company's annual greenhouse gas emissions accounting is complete, accurate, and complies with the GHG Protocol's requirements. Could you break that down for us?
Sure. So a third party verifier is just some entity that was not involved in generating the measurements. That entity needs to review and sign off that the measurement was accurate. So greenhouse gas verification is its own field. There are several firms that specialize in kind of just doing that, along with other like certification and verification activity. Our firm does some verification as well. But again, the trick is really to be sort of the third party. So it can't be someone who has already been involved, because in that way, it's sort of like grading your own homework. So it needs to be someone who is separate from your company, and probably even if you worked with a consultant to come up with the numbers, someone separate from that consultant. I think other than that, is there anything else you feel that isn't necessarily clear with third-party verification? Because I'm familiar with the field, but I know sometimes it is a little esoteric for others.
I don't think so. I think that makes sense. And so the second impact topic under measuring greenhouse gas emissions, it's the science-based target section. The second requirement says the company sets a 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned science-based net zero target, including interim targets, to contribute to reaching global net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And larger companies have stricter requirements around absolute emissions. What does that mean?
Science-based targets comes to us from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has been around for maybe just 7 years now. Its genesis was really in the Paris Agreement in 2015, where countries of the world agreed to limit warming to at least less than 2 degrees of warming, and then make efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming. And the idea behind science-based targets is pretty simple and reflects what B-Lab sort of wrote in the standard. Our best understanding of climate science indicates we need to make dramatic emissions reductions. So setting targets any less ambitious than that does not make sense. So there's a specific structure, and ultimately there's an amount of reduction you need to make over a given time frame. So science-based targets as a program, usually the focus is on a near-term target. B-Lab is sort of focusing more on the net zero target, which I found interesting, but it's very compatible, and science-based targets does embrace and have definitions of net zero targets. But B-Lab is really focused on the net zero by 2050, and then every 5 years, at every 5-year increment, you should have interim targets. So they say you need to set one for 2030, and then the idea, the way it's written, is like, well, then you'd have one for 2035 when you get 2030, 2040, 2045, et cetera. So continuing to make progress. 8,500 companies, many of them multinationals, have embraced science-based targets. And so they and the companies in their supply chains are already caught up with science-based targets. I would consider it sort of a gold standard for emissions reduction. And that's what B-Lab is really trying to embrace with this requirement.
One thing around science-based target that I've heard you talk about, which seems to set it apart from other initiatives, is the focus on absolute reductions, or reductions instead of offsets. So could you talk about what the difference is between those two and why that's really important to?
Sure. Many companies will set a climate strategy and historically have talked about having a net zero goal or a carbon neutral goal, where a lot of that is mediated through carbon offsets, which are projects outside of your value chain, like reforestation or investing in renewable energy in India, or any number of other projects that are there to try and create carbon benefit. To what you just said, Ryan, science-based targets is really about emissions reduction. So they historically have not allowed the use of offsets. They're saying whatever your gross emissions that you measured in your baseline year, that just needs to drop on the order of 40 to 50% by 2030.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. And I remember even in our course, I think you had said something about like Microsoft, which has been a leader in this, had science-based targets, but then they had to back off of them because of having trouble meeting the absolute reductions versus just offsetting. Is that your understanding?
That was so they stepped away from their net zero goal. And yeah, there was this piece in GreenBiz, I think, that came back out in March or April, where it just highlighted that 200 companies had sort of dropped their net zero goal. And what it was pointing to is a lot of companies felt very challenged on making their scope 3 goals, which is understandable. These are ambitious goals and you have less control over what's happening there. Also, Amazon sort of famously stepped away from their science-based target, I think, totally last year. And if I were to bet money on companies that have, the assets and the mindset to actually tackle science-based targets, Amazon and Microsoft would have been pretty high on the list, because the tech companies have been pretty ambitious about their goals. Microsoft still has this credible strategy. I understand they still have a near-term target. I'd still expect companies like Microsoft and others to be working on this, but they did step back on scope 3 in particular. And the other thing I want to say, so with scope 3, actually, you do have an option to do an intensity target because you do have less control. So it's not necessarily that you need to make absolute on scope 3. For scope 1 and scope 2, you need to address your gross, as we called them earlier, but also called absolute emissions. Scope 3, you have more flexibility on your options.
I think a lot of companies, at least in the tech world, have backed off partly because of the increased compute power needed to power a lot of the AI systems, right? I've heard that all these companies are going for clean electricity, but there's so much data computing power needed to power, like for Microsoft, to like power ChatGPT and all these AI systems that it would actually like shut down the grid of California if they like fully powered up like all of their AI systems at once. So AI, which has been heralded as like, hey, maybe it will help us find efficiency. I listened to a great podcast with, I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Nate Hagens, but it's all about the paradox of AI being able to find some marginal efficiencies, but just like the computing power itself actually putting us backwards in terms of climate goals. And so
Google just reported their annual emissions and showed it going up steadily since 2020. And that was exactly the reason they pointed to. The fact that was mostly data center use, and AI has, I don't think it's like 5 times, or there was a Goldman Sachs study that said 10 times the amount of energy as sort of a typical online search. Which is why we try not to use AI actually in our own operations, because there's clearly things it does well in terms of like qualitatively answering things. Most of our work is quantitative. I'm not interested in increasing our own footprints for what at the moment seem to be sort of relatively marginal benefits.
Yeah. Okay. So for that science-based net zero target, in this requirement, the evidence that B-Lab requires is a copy of the greenhouse gas emissions report or raw emissions data for the baseline year, and or a published sustainability report with documentation of formally established net zero target, which is in line with the Paris Agreement. How are small businesses going to meet these requirements? And then I also would be interested in how are calling out specifically those small remote services, the remote first teams as well.
Well, isn't that the perennial question around here? How are small businesses going to do any of this?
Truly.
Well, so the first part of that sounded pretty similar to what was required for the measurement. It was kind of the copy of the greenhouse gas emissions. And it says baseline year. So what that means, that's actually the first year. So that should actually be the same. It looks to me what's sort of the real part of this is the report with the formal target, which actually also sounds like sort of a one-time thing. So it almost suggests that maybe when you recertify, it would almost be the same documents if your target hasn't changed and your base year hasn't changed. So I think if you're an organization that works on a sustainability report, and I have seen some B Corps, even smaller B Corps, do that, but clearly not all of us are. And I'll say us because we are a B Corp too. There are some mechanisms, like if you were in that net zero by 2030 cohort I talked about, and you signed up for SME Climate Hub, that does require some reporting, and you can do sort of a kind of no frills sustainability reports. or even climate report, because they're not necessarily dictating how broadly you have to talk about sustainability here. Although in some of your other impact areas, I don't know if they talk about different things you need to disclose in the other parts of the standard. So maybe that does point to a broader sustainability report. But I think as long as you set the target, have something publicly available that discloses it, and just have a copy of emissions year, I don't know that this is going to be as onerous maybe as some of the other aspects of this, but we'll have to look at when we look at transition plan. We can kind of get into the details to see how complex it looks like that is.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it points to how the term that B-Lab is using is interoperable. These impact topics are, and they often reference one another, but also it's not the most straightforward way. So it's like constantly sort of like jumping back and forth and being like, I think they're referring to this specific evidence point that they were talking about in this other impact topic. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
It would be interesting, I think, to look across them and how many reference sustainability reports. So what your sustainability report would need to holistically include, I guess, part of the strategy on certifying or recertifying.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Are there certifications companies can get for science-based target meeting those, or net zero, or some of these concepts?
You can formally apply to Science-Based Targets Initiative to have your target validated. That would be on the costly side, I think, for most smaller B corporations, but it's something you could certainly look at. For companies that certify as climate neutral requires a science-aligned target, which is similar to a science-based target, but has some flexibility to it. And actually, it would be interesting to look at whether climate neutral in all cases meets B Corp's or sort of the B Lab's definition here, because I suspect it might not. But climate neutral's a case where if you get the certification, you need to have a very similarly structured target. So that could help actually meet, I think, the requirements that we were just talking about if you've gone through those processes. There are probably others out there, but those are the ones that come to mind in terms of targets. I guess I mentioned SME Climate Hub earlier, so that's relatively simple, but you do need to report to that. So if you're in that process, that could also help meet these requirements as well.
Got it.
Yeah, and then through SME Climate Hub, you are committing to this target publicly, and I guess they're like giving you a certificate, or you're listed in a directory. How does that work?
Yeah, you'd be listed, and it's pretty streamlined. So the commitment is to cut your emissions in half by 2030 and then have a net zero goal by 2050. So it is very aligned with what is in the standard.
Got it.
One thing I will say, David, is maybe this is a somewhat controversial thing to say, but it feels like a lot of companies are going to be bullshitting about their goal to like cut emissions by 2030 and like really have no idea or intention to hit it because just business realities of running a business. So do we, even though it feels good to say we have a goal, I just can imagine the majority of companies who set these goals by 2030 being like, oops, we didn't do it. And so I don't know, how do you reconcile? Do you feel like I'm off in my analysis or like, how do you sit with that tension?
Well, it gets more challenging to do this the closer 2030 gets. And 2030 felt like a long way off a while ago. It doesn't to me now, when you look at sort of the scale of changes that companies are needing to tackle. I would say that most companies I interact with are seriously setting these goals. There's an art as well as a science portion of it in my mind. When we kind of go through the process, and part of it is actually trying to model forward, like what actions are you planning to do and how much will that reduce your emissions over time? We can frequently come up with maybe a 20% to 30% drop in emissions, which is significant, but it's not enough to hit the 40 to 50% we were just talking about a little while ago. So part of the target is having some assurance that you can make decent progress. And another part of it is your leadership taking a leap of faith that this is the right path to be on. This is what the demands of most stakeholders are asking you to do. And this is the right effort to take on. Whether I'm actually maybe less interested in every company absolutely hitting the goal and more interested in companies making genuine efforts, honestly accounting, because actually the easier way to do it is to cheat on the accounting and actually say, hey, we hit our goal, even if best practice doesn't say you did. And moving forward on decarbonization efforts. And if some of those only gets a 30 or 40%, that's 30 or 40% better than they were at 5 years ago.
Thanks for reining me back in a little. That was good.
Well, but I think I certainly can see companies that are less vested in this is doing it now that there's regulations coming out on this too, which we're not really getting into here. But I can see companies that have not been very engaged and don't really see the business value of this could certainly do, yeah, we'll do that. And I guess there will have to be a reckoning later on. I don't know any countries have like corporate death penalties kind of around this, but maybe there will be some ramifications or implications for not hitting your goal. We'll see.
Yeah, and I think there's something to this process. It increases transparency around companies' efforts. And even if it's not the most transparent, whatever data that they're publishing, there's still substantially more stakeholders that now have this information in their hands and can like do something about it and be nudging these companies to like be honest and straightforward and report the information as they have it. So I think there's a few ways to go about it.
Transparency is something we talk about a lot. And I think that helps get behind greenwashing because it's like, you can say, well, here's our assumptions. Here's kind of what went into it. So you can maybe question some of the assumptions, but you shouldn't question the rest of the process. And if you're disclosing that, that's about as good as you can get.
Yeah.
So maybe I got a little ahead of over my skis because the next section, which B-Lab has thoughtfully placed in here. So as a reminder, we talked first measuring GHG emissions. Second, we talked about a science-based target. And the third and final sort of component of this larger topic is called climate transition plan. And so what B-Lab says, and this is a mouthful and could make people start to curl up into a ball. So I'm going to read this and then we can talk about what this might mean for a company. So this final section says, the company must define a climate transition plan to reach its net zero target to contribute to net zero emissions globally. The intent of this sub-requirement is to ensure the company identifies the actions that will help address GHG emissions so that the interim and long-term net zero targets become meaningful and actionable. So B-Lab's essentially saying, Ryan, we heard you. There's one thing to just claim a bunch of science-based target, but we want people to actually list out their plan. And so B-Lab notes that the climate transition plan should include a number of bullet points. First, it should address the company's major GHG emission sources across scope 1, 2, and 3. Second, it should include GHG mitigation actions to reach the company's targets. Third, it should include clearly defined roles and responsibilities where applicable. Fourth, it should outline how the company will work and engage with relevant stakeholders. For example, stakeholders in the value chain, peers, industry alliances, governments, local communities, trade or associations, and civil society organizations. Fifth, it includes a viable resourcing plan to achieve the company's targets. Sixth, it details how the company's current or future business model supports achieving the company's target. And finally, is approved by the highest governing body. So, wow, that is amazingly detailed and difficult requirement. So I love the detail and thoughtfulness B-Lab put in, but I worry that B-Lab assumes companies have endless hours and like PhD students on staff to like calculate all this stuff and put together reports. Can you break down, well, first, what do you think of this climate transition plan sort of requirement? And does this meet, from your experience, is this a key component of the larger climate action sort of topic and movement?
This is tracking some of the voluntary reporting standards and also the regulations I was just talking about, notably in the EU. CSRD is one acronym you'll hear. This one, not so need to worry about the definitions. And CS3D is EU regulations. CSRD is sort of like reporting and disclosure. And part of what it asks for is to like disclose part of your transition plan. And then the CS3D, it's like this due diligence directive, actually requires companies to have a transition plan. And that's part of where the transition plan language is coming from. There's also the reporting standard for sustainability that really seems to be emerging as maybe the international standard is ISSB. It's like International Sustainability Standards Board. And they also ask about transition plans. So I think part of this language is tracking that. And it is designed to get past the issue that you were talking about. I think a big criticism, a lot of the reporting requirements out there, it's just disclosure. So just talk about what you're doing So if you diligently document how your emissions keep going up and up and up, that could meet a lot of the reporting requirements. But clearly that's not why we're doing this in the first place. The idea is to reduce emissions. And so these requirements on transition plans, I think, are what at least countries and some of the voluntary standards are looking to help drive that forward. It is a lot. I think in our work, after we've identified where the hotspots of emissions are, we sort of naturally come in and generate a reduction action plan that at a high level will say, well, here's the portfolio of 5 to 10 actions that you can implement over the next 5 years that look like they'll have real potential to reduce your emissions. That does not include all the different aspects of transition plans that you just read off, just transition, stakeholder engagement, et cetera. So I don't know if that would meet it, but I think the general intention here is just to have something tangible that companies are going to move forward. So I think most companies that are serious about this, they should have some form of plan. The question to me would be whether it sort of like meets all these different transition plan criteria.
Got it. Yeah. Could you give listeners maybe a couple examples of, I don't know if maybe it's for the small to medium service business and then a manufacturer, probably the manufacturer is like actually a lot easier to like think of examples, but what are the types of things we're even talking about that you usually come across in your work?
In which aspects of transition plan are we talking about here?
Like, hey, so in order to meet your 2030 target, we have to reduce by 40 or 50% or something. And so these are like 5 things I recommend. What are actually those 5 things that, like, for example, that you might recommend?
Got it. So for a manufacturer, something typically like incorporating recycled contents into packaging and products could be a very viable way to reduce emissions. For companies that are using air freights, if you can shift that to sea, and road freight, if you can shift to the extent you can shift that to rail, has benefits. And that's just because those modes are inherently more carbon efficient. One big part of the work with Scope 3 is supplier engagement. That's almost a mantra, I think, for people working on this. But if you can get your suppliers to incorporate the same energy efficiency and renewable energy and refrigerant management and other programs that you have for your own operations, that can certainly help in your supply chain. And I am thinking I'm missing another couple of common recommendations that come up for manufacturers, but if those come back,
probably some like reducing HVAC use or something like that.
I mean, I guess you'd have renewables. Procuring renewable energy is one that's probably the easiest because there are ways that you can buy renewable energy without doing installation like on your own facilities, or you can invest in renewables off-site. So that's one that certainly comes up. And that is also something you can do with your supply chain. And I'm not pretending what I just listed out meets all the different aspects of transition plans, but this would be the sort of content that should feed into a transition plan.
Right. Which is, just sort of one aspect of this whole requirement here.
Yeah. The mitigation actions.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. And then how should companies incorporate the concept of a just transition into their plans?
I'd probably have to look at how B-Lab is defining that, but I understand part of it is engaging workers, as I recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Another part is engaging stakeholders and identifying their stakeholders. There are groups within like B-Lab US and Canada that have been working on this. There was a climate justice playbook that came up a couple years ago, and another climate justice guide that came out this year. Forum for the Future was also involved with it, although I'm blanking on the exact name. But there were some nicely tangible examples of like how companies are gone about tackling what they would consider climate justice, which I would argue is very aligned with just transition, even though it's a different word. But I think part of this is on looking at where do you have facilities. So even if you're a service company, you're based somewhere, who would be the stakeholders in the area that are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate impacts? And are there ways to design your climate actions to actually help them as well as improve your footprint? And I guess I could give a shout out for Kylie Nealis, for anyone who knows Kylie Nealis. Kylie's working on climate justice for B-Lab US and Canada and thinking about how all of us can better integrate all these measures. So get in touch with her and B Corp Climate Collective.
Yes, the Kylie and B-Lab US and Canada team, along with Forum for the Future, put out that business guide to advancing climate justice that you're referring to. And it's a really wonderful report. It's like, not only is it pretty, but also it's extremely useful. It has some great ideas and great starting points for a lot of companies at different phases of their journeys.
Yeah, I thought they made it nicely tangible in an area which people talk a lot about process, but it wasn't always like hard to visualize. Like, what do I actually do? And
Exactly.
part of the goal of that earlier handbook is like, well, we don't want to give you the answers. We're just giving you questions. But I think the examples in that certainly help on just transition.
I think so too.
I did just want to also say, with an international listening audience, I know that UK, Canada, and Europe and Asia and South America have also made a ton of progress on this. And sometimes, especially on climate, the US is lagging behind other areas. So I just want to give a shout out to the other B Corps in different regions who have made progress on this, and just want to encourage folks to go to their local B Lab or B Corp entity and sort of read some of the latest from each of the entities on what they're up to, because yeah, the US is often behind on these things. So credit where credit is due to other regions. So David, moving towards the latter, couple questions here. What are some of the common challenges that companies face when taking on the type of climate action work that we've outlined in this section, and how might they potentially overcome those challenges?
There can be quite a few challenges. Part of the reason we're sort of stuck with these problems is they're not easy when you're operating in a system that's predicated on the use of fossil fuel and has all these systems that were designed to use it. And that's what we're all trying to design ourselves out of now. So I think, but just beyond that, I think one challenge, particularly for smaller companies, is like ownership. Like, you are often not owning your own headquarters, so you can't necessarily make the call to install solar or do other efficiency upgrades. You're having to work with a landlord. A lot of times you can't even get the data on usage because you might be in a shared space and you're not getting access to the data that would inform kind of better action. And that's sort of inherently the issue in kind of working with suppliers. Like, you, again, don't control what they do, and you don't have ownership or are able to make the direct call on what actions to take there. So that really comes back to sort of this idea of collaboration. And this is easier to do when you have leverage over your supplier, like you're a significant part of their business. This is often why companies actually build coalitions, because as a coalition, you might actually have more buying power over specific entities you need to take action. But even just assuming you're a part of their business that they value, you can kind of come back to them, just ask them, what are you doing on greenhouse gas emissions? Have you thought about tackling your footprint, either with installing renewables or how you're transporting materials or a number of other things? I think even just asking those questions starts to get teams elsewhere kind of thinking about taking action in places they may not have already have been. So that's certainly part of it. And I mentioned I work with some larger companies that do a lot on renewable energy procurement. So there's, whether you're just going to the renewable energy credit market, which is kind of just to define that, there's kind of an open market where you can purchase credit for renewable energy. The shortcoming of that is it's generally not putting new renewables onto the grid and transforming the grid in the way we needed to. But the accounting rules say you can count that. And you can also think of it as just sort of like starting, and beyond, after you've done that for a while, you can look at building relationships to develop renewable projects elsewhere that actually are providing additional renewables onto the grid. Other challenges, I think, can be sort of case by case. Business travel can be a challenging one for companies that have that as sort of inherent part of that and who like to go to conferences and do other things. And for service companies, I know business travel comes up a lot too.
Absolutely.
Could you speak a little bit to the sort of like data challenge? I feel like there's so many folks who don't quite understand what they're getting themselves into until they're chasing down utility bills and all this like pretty obscure documentation that they haven't ever really thought about in this context before. If you have any like tips and tricks along those lines.
Sure. So data collection is, kind of core to making all of this happen. Utility bills are at least relatively straightforward. You can go to your landlord, they can provide them. It tells you exactly what the electricity and natural gas and what other metered utility bills are. So in accounting, the general bias and what you try to get is what they call primary data, which would be direct data specific to your operations.
Mm-hmm.
Frequently, you can't get that. For example, if you're trying to go to a supplier and try to understand what exactly their utility usage is, you just know how much pounds of flour or how many kilograms of steel you purchased from them. So frequently using proxy data that is out there that says, generally, when you purchase a kilogram of steel, here's what the footprint of that is. When you buy a pound of wheat flour, here's what the footprint is. And that can be acceptable if you can't get the primary data. And what a lot of organizations are comfortable using what we call proxy data, but again, that's secondary data that you can't get direct data from your supply chain. And I generally encourage people to think about this as a process. So I mentioned it's a 4-month time frame. If you're taking that streamlined approach, maybe it's only a couple of weeks, but try to get continual improvement in there where you flag the gaps in places where there's great uncertainty and try to work on that in future years to get better data. So it's not just nailing everything right in your first year of doing this, but really view it again as sort of a process, and you're trying to improve as you go along.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and also is something that I think is particularly relevant right now as the timeline for adopting the next version of the B Corp standards is sort of shifting more towards the end of 2025 and early 2026. 2025 is a great year to try to test all of these things out with this 2024 data as a baseline year. So yeah, and I like the whole MVP idea too, is like, if you're doing it yourself, you're probably not going to get everything right the first time, but there's always room for improvement.
MVP is a good way to think about it.
Yeah. And then could you share any success stories of smaller companies that have effectively adopted similar climate action standards?
Well, I think we're in a regime where we haven't made as much progress, I think, as we'd like. So I can't say I have an amazing number of examples of companies that have hit a science-based target yet. For one, a lot of those are sort of 2030, so I'm still waiting to see how companies do. And smaller companies are generally not as visible as well. So I know there are companies that, again, through like renewable energy procurement, can kind of address their own footprints in a credible way. And for a lot of us who would just have offices, electricity is kind of a significant portion of your footprint. So I would definitely look at renewable energy procurement options if you haven't yet started on those fronts. I do not have a great number of success stories on the top of my head, though. Let me get back to you on that, because we all need more success stories.
Yeah. And I mean, it just goes to show, how few folks, especially the smaller size businesses, are actually actively doing these things on a regular basis. I hope that helps folks feel like they're not alone in this process, because a lot of us are going through this.
Yeah. And I would just say one thing that's been helpful for me is, this is like a bit of a side detour before we wrap, but the podcast I was thinking of earlier, it's called The Great Simplification with Nate Hagans, and he interviews Daniel Schmachtenberger. And what they talk about is Jevons paradox, which is this belief, like, if we have more renewables, we'll like reduce fossil usage. But what's been happening is every year we have more renewables coming online, but every year fossil fuel usage still goes up. And so what it does is it's just simply adding more renewables to our system without some of the other cultural changes and ways to like bind behavior, means that we're just using more energy total, but it's not like we're actually reducing fossil fuel usage. And so I guess this is like a long way of saying, I really think this work is super important to get a baseline, and there's an additional layer of like, what is the cultural and other changes in like behavioral shifts that we need to make in addition to like just simply reducing emissions. I don't know, David, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
well, fossil fuel consumption will go down if greenhouse gas emissions go down. So I think if you're using greenhouse gas emissions as the metric, that should eventually help versus what I heard you say is just we're looking at like renewable energy and there's more megawatts, but we're just using a lot more energy. So the actual footprint isn't going down.
Yeah.
I think that's real. And then you also have like rebound effect where sometimes when people get more efficient, they just use devices like twice as much because I guess they're used to paying a certain amount of energy. So if they're paying that much, it's okay to use half. I guess you're using twice as much energy at sort of half the impact. So things like that certainly can happen, but we're all doing what we can. And I think, focusing again on sort of the right metrics is critical in that.
Cool. Last two questions here. So first is, what do you need right now? And how can listeners help support whatever you're up to?
That's a good question. So most of my work is helping enable other companies reduce their greenhouse gas footprint in sort of a tangible and credible way. That's also trying to be part of this overall movement that is reducing kind of greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess what I need is what the broader stakeholders need. Every business to be actively engaged on climate action, getting their hands around what their footprint is, and even more important, understanding the levers they have to reduce that footprint. So I guess that's both what I would need and I think how listeners can support, because you're tapping into the B Corp community. It looks like we'll be needing to do this on our certifications and recertifications, but no need to wait for a recertification. Get started now so you start working your climate muscles and are that much more able to tackle it when you do need to report everything that the new standard will ask you to report.
Yeah, I love that because it's going to be required. So we might as well get going.
I'm a fan. And especially for small businesses, there are tools out there that you can start doing this right now today, and would highly encourage folks to start to at least try it as soon as possible to get a sense and a feel for it.
And David, where can folks learn more about your work? If you want to shout out anything that you're working on or a place where people can learn more, contact info, et cetera.
Sure. So my company is Climate Positive Consulting. And so that's just www.climatepositiveconsulting.com. Probably even at least as up to date as following me on LinkedIn. So if you look for David Jaber and you see Climate Positive Consulting pop up, that's me. And those would be the main ways, but you're also welcome to reach out to me directly. And that was just first initial, last name, djaber@climatepositiveconsulting.com.
Great. So no TikTok page or anything? You do?
No TikTok. And if I did, it probably wouldn't be business oriented.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, David, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for helping us make sense or begin to make sense of this complex topic. I do want to remind folks, David's class at terra.do, even if you can't catch this current cohort, check it out for the future because it's super helpful. And yeah, we'll have to get you back on the show once the standards are finalized.
Yeah, exactly. We'll wait to see what comes out from that. But thank you for the invitation and thank you for this platform. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts." Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.